All right. Hello, Ian. And we started off, right? We added our dependencies. I'm going to actually get rid of this stuff. And really, because what we want to do here is implement a backend feature which has an endpoint to get an icon for a particular word, specifically a noun. Under the hood, we are going to use the noun project API to get the data for this feature. And our own Django API endpoint will be a sort of wrapper layer right over the noun project API. And so we've added dependencies. I want to get this prototype working. We've made the app. And what I actually need to do is I need to create my API view before I can start using the requests library and following their guide code from the example and so on. And so that's sort of, I think, a good recap of what we were just doing. We added these dependencies. We made our Django app and did a little simple routing. We now need to make our API view so we can start making this real. So I am going to go ahead and open up the views.py for our API app, Django app. And I know that we're going to want to use the REST framework API view. And let's see, why are we getting the squiggly here? That is actually super helpful. I totally forgot my import statement. So I know that with Python and VS Code, there can be a lot of squigglies, but that's why they can really be your friend if you get in the habit of trying to keep them to a minimum and pay attention as you go. Now it's just telling me this is unused, which is a different kind of squiggly, right? That's more of a friendly note. I'm probably also going to want from the REST framework the response class, which we've used before. And we are going to want to use requests. And actually, we just have to import it like this. And in fact, it's a little ironic that they're telling us here, but I'm sure if we looked in the request, read the docs, and they're getting started, we would see an example of how to import it. It looks like we just import the whole module, and then we just use methods on this module, kind of. And this is pretty much what we're going to do right here. What you can see in this example code from this hover. For requests OAuth lib, however, we actually do have to import a specific class. And I have another typo here, and this was sort of hinting me out. And the fact that I wasn't getting type completion as I tabbed kind of told me that something was wrong. And we want to use, we're probably going to want to use the OAuth 1 authentication. And I can tell that I have another typo here because, again, I'm not getting that nice VS Code autocomplete. And now this looks about right. Pinelands, which is this sort of Python linting thing, is a little finicky. So I can ignore that. Importantly, VS Code is telling me, hey, we know this is a class, and it's grabbing the doc string that goes along with that class, probably in the class definition for this information here. So I know my import statement is correct, and I can probably ignore most of these squigglies. And by the way, if I do Python select interpreter, and if I give it the path of where Python lives in my virtual environment directory, which is under /bin Python 3.11 over here. This is the version of Python that we've installed with this particular virtual environment and that we're using. And if I right click and I do copy path, I should be able to paste this in and hit enter. And it might take a minute, but some of those squigglies will go away. But let's go ahead and build out our API view now that we've kind of done our setup work. And a lot of this should look pretty familiar. We're going to want a get endpoint as before. And now we're starting to get to the good stuff, right? And if I kind of jump back to, let's see if they have in the noun project. In fact, they pretty much give us this guide code. And I'm actually just going to copy and paste this guide code and use it, especially with a new library. Sometimes libraries, and code really want to be used in specific ways. So it's actually not the worst idea to, as long as you're doing it deliberately and intentionally, doing some copying and pasting. And we can leave this here and see how we go. And now I'm going to put in my OAuth keys and secret keys in here, which I should have floating around over here. So I'm hard coding these in here. We don't really want to do this, and very shortly we'll see how to avoid doing this. But for prototyping, for learning purposes and for prototyping, this is totally fine. But just to reiterate, very shortly we'll see how to avoid hard coding these API keys and secrets in our code. And for security reasons, you really don't want to have these hard coded in your code. Every now and then there might be an exception to that rule, but that's really something you want to avoid, and that's not good. So now I've got auth, I've got endpoint, I've got we use the requests library to make a get request. And I do have a squiggly here, so I do want to do a little investigation. Missing timeout argument can cause this to hang indefinitely. So I'm going to sort of choose to ignore that because it's not telling me something is wrong. It's telling me it's recommended pass a timeout argument for the requests library so this doesn't take forever. And in the final version of our code, we probably should do that. But for prototyping, I don't care because I'm going to be manually killing and restarting this a bunch. And here we've got response.content. And again, this is really coming from the noun project API, and we can poke into the requests library as well to see exactly what response.content is. But we can go ahead and run this. And I'm not even going to have this return anything right now. I might just have it return true, or actually we probably do want it to return a response so Django doesn't freak out. But let's just see how far we get with this and running it. And now I can make this path real, and I can also import from my views my noun project view, although let's see here.
You forgot
and of course, yeah. Thank you so much, Megan. Totally had a brain freeze there for a moment. And that squiggly is just about the doc string. So this looks about right. So now I should be able to hit this endpoint, right, and see what happens with our code. And in fact, what I think I'll do over here is let's use Thunder Client, and it's not HTTPS, it's just HTTP. And let's hit right, here's our Django app. And if I send this get request, it should send me page not found and all that good stuff. And if I do /API, /v1/Pokemon, I should get back our Pokemon. And I can expand this to look at all the response JSON and whatnot. Let's do this for nouns. And remember, so let's hit this new endpoint that we wrote. So if you recall, we added API/v1/noun, and the base or root path just uses our noun project. And this doesn't even return anything yet. I actually want to pay attention to the print statements here in the terminal. I just want to send an HTTP request to this endpoint with Thunder client to get this code to execute. So this looks really messy, but this is a good start because we actually talked to the noun project, right? And I'm seeing there's a, it looks like this is JSON, but something has gotten messed up with the serialization or formatting because I'm seeing all these /n, all these new lines. We can do, there's response.txt as well with the response library. And that is actually much easier to read, right? This is like nicely formatted JSON, and we can see that we're getting stuff back. And then, what we really want is, let's use that nifty looking JSON method call that the request library gave us, and let's see what that looks like. So, right, this is similar to response.txt, but it's much more compact. But this looks like a good start for what we want to send back to our client. And now, when I send this request, I've got all the JSON that I want. And I know it's a little hard to read in here, so let me throw this up in the browser and we can watch this happen here as well. Right, so now we've just written an API endpoint for our Django API that is using a third-party API under the hood. There's more to do. We probably don't want to send back all of this data, but this is a good start. So I just want to pause and check in and see what questions people have. Everyone feeling pretty good? Cool. So we'll come back to this because I probably really just care about the stuff here, like the lists of the different icons. I probably don't necessarily want to send back all this data, but we can cross that bridge later. The next step is sort of what I alluded to earlier of let's get these secret keys out of our Python code. Right, so I've got in my prototype working. I'm using requests. I've got my print statements. I've written my route. Let's see how we can use what's called a .env file. And I'm gonna go ahead and just comment out those print statements for now. And in fact, I'll just put those there. So this is a really common pattern, not just with Django, but all sorts of software. This is usually how secret information is stored. Basically, what you want to do is in the root directory of our project. In this case, it's the root directory of really the Django backend, because these secrets are really specific to our backend application. The React front end doesn't need to know or care about them because the React front end is just going to talk to our Django app. So inside this backend directory, which is the root of the Django part of our project, I'm going to create two files, a file named .env and a file named .env example. And the .env file is where the actual secret keys are going to go. The .env example is going to be an example of what sort of stuff should be in there. And the reason is that .env file, we do not want to check into version control. So let me show you what the .env file is going to look at, how we're going to avoid checking into version control with a get-ignore file, and why the .env example file is important. And then I'll show how Django can access these files. So the .env file is relatively straightforward. And we're about to create some environment variables, and this should look very similar to sort of shell environment variables, which we've seen a little bit here and there. And the convention is you usually want these variables to be all caps. So we're going to do API key, and we're going to do, and in fact, I'm just going to call this noun project API key just to be extra verbose and specific, and noun project secret key. And I'm just going to go ahead, in fact, and copy all this stuff and then do a little modification. Sorry, my Vim mode and sort of like normal modes are clashing a little bit here. You know, I normally avoid copying and pasting, and sort of for learning purposes, encourage you all to as well. The thing here is we want to make sure that the two things you want to avoid when copying around these secret key values are missing something and adding in a space, an empty character by mistake, right? So here, copying and pasting, or even better, like using like a program to kind of generate this is your friend. So I don't need those. And this is the format of putting stuff in an environment file, a .env file. And it's pretty straightforward. The environment variable is in all caps. And again, you know, where this originates is with the shell, with this path environment variable and all these other environment variables. This is the environment that our Django program is running in. All caps, an equal sign, no spaces, and you don't need quotes. With certain special characters, you might need double quotes. But most of the time we don't, especially for alphanumeric stuff. So now that I've created this .env file, the most important thing is to not put it in version control. And to do that, I'm going to create what's called a .getignore file. And in fact, I've already gone ahead and done this. And I have my virtual environment directory in here because I don't want that checked into version control either. We just need requirements txt. And the getignore file doesn't care if something, you know, it'll figure out if it's a directory or file. If you want, you can add the slash at the end. It doesn't make a big difference. I'm going to add .env for this environment file because we never want these secrets in version control. And as you're noticing, these files that start with a dot are sort of by convention, a dot file holds like configuration type stuff. And you can put multiple getignore files all over your project wherever you want. And they work with the current directory, and you can use like relative paths and stuff. And then lastly, what I'm going to do is create an env example file. And this one is going to get put into version control. And so let me show you what this looks like. And this is a good practice because this is how we document for other programmers what environment variables our program needs to run. So if I'm cloning someone's project and I'm setting it up for the first time, this is going to be one of the first things that I look at. And if I see this in a .env example file, I'm going to know, cool, all right, I need to get an API key, and you know, hopefully the README will say, hey, this is the noun project and here's the link to it. But I'll know, all right, we need these environment variables, and I know that these are placeholders, right? And that's just sort of the convention that you've seen where this stuff inside the angle brackets is a placeholder. So this will get checked into version control, and that's a way to document the environment variables that our program needs for other programmers. And the next step here then is to hook this up so Django can use these things. Before I do that, I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have questions about stuff. Cool. So a popular library that's used for this, because this is a common situation for not just Django, but all sorts of software with Python, is if I just Google python.env, there's this library, python-.env, and it does exactly what we want, which is it reads key value pairs from a .env file. There's a whole, like, post-graduation, this is actually a great read for sort of like application design, and .env files are a part of it. Specifically this bit where there's this principle, we should store config in environment variables, because the other advantage of this is as I start having different environments for development and production, maybe I have like a dev noun project API key, or I can just change these values in my .env file on my computer where I do local dev, and when we deploy to Amazon Web Services, like in a server in the cloud, have different values for there as well. For the noun project API, we probably wouldn't do that, but for other sorts of environment variables, that's very common. So that's a little out of scope, but one piece of sort of the value and power of environment variables. But so going back to this python.env project, and I'll share the link with this in the chat. If someone can throw it in Slack, that would be awesome. Though again, we have this documented. This is pretty straightforward to use. Again, just because it's a new library, I'm going to take a quick look at getting started. And they say pip install python env. They give an example of the env file. And then here, they're giving a couple examples of how to use it. And that's what we're going to do in just a minute is go ahead and use this. And we see there's this .env file use, there's this load.env. So there's a couple different ways to do this, and I'm going to show you what's probably the easiest and swiftest way. So first off, we have to add this as a dependency to our project. And I want to update my requirements.txt so that other people, when they clone and install this project, will have all of our dependencies. And what we're actually going to do is use this in settings py. And there are a couple reasons. The first is an environment variable is something that, we might want other parts of Django to access, even though we're only using it in this one spot right now. Also, just in terms of organizing stuff, settings py is sort of, Django's global config file that runs when Django first starts up. So it is the place that other programmers will expect to see things like environment variables. And, that if we look at all these constants, we can sort of see that that's happening here. And though we haven't seen this yet, we can actually export stuff really easily from really any Django module, any file, and import it. And you'll see that in a sec, and it actually works quite nicely. So let's go ahead and import our .env module. And we're going to import this function .env values. And if I hover over it for a sec, it tells me what it does. And we see a nice example here. And the important part is right here where it says it parses a .env file and returns its contents as a dictionary, which is awesome, right? That is super useful to get a nice dictionary of our environment variables. And I'm going to go ahead and add it to the end. You probably, for stuff that we're adding like this, the settings py, I would either do it at the very beginning or the very end. Maybe the end is a little better because if it breaks last, but honestly, it doesn't make a difference. It's really personal preference. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable named env, and we're going to use this .env values function. And we're going to pass it the name of our file. And this is in fact a relative path because settings py's Oh, I apologize. It is not a relative path. We don't need to worry about that. It will look in the Django project root. Sorry about that confusion. And that's one of the nice things, in fact, about using this .env library is it'll look in the Django project root, which is the same place that manage.py is in, right? Which is where we put that .env file. So we just have to tell it the name, which is almost always going to be .env. Again, sometimes you might have like .env.dev or something like that, but it's almost always just .env. And now what I can do is something like this, because this is a dictionary, env.get noun projects API key. And if I wanted to, I could in fact print this out. And I believe when I start up Django, we should in fact see that right off the bat. And I'll just add another print statement here, just saying settings py, so we can find this a little more easily. And just to see this happen and make sure I haven't broken anything, let's run the server. So we can see Django actually looks at the settings py file twice, and we're grabbing that environment variable. Right, we've put it in this .env file. The .env module knows to go to that file and how to parse it to turn these into a Python dictionary that we can interact with really nicely. And now I'm going to hook this up to our actual API view and stuff, but I just want to check in and see if folks have any questions about stuff. Cool. So I know this doesn't seem like a lot, but environment variables are actually super important.
Adam,
Oh, yeah. What's up?
I did have a question. This goes back just a little bit. You put, let's see. Oh, in the .env.example,
Mhm.
you put noun project secret key in angle brackets. I'm just wondering why that's in angle brackets.
Oh, yeah. That's just a convention, like the angle brackets for a placeholder value. Like you think with like
Yeah.
secret key value goes here. That actually would be better than like, I think.
Sure.
Yeah. Like, because remember this example file, the .env module is never going to interact with this. This is 100% to document what environment variables we should use for other programmers. Because the .env file never gets checked into version control, but this example file does. So I can put anything I want there. It doesn't need to be angle brackets. That's just sort of a convention that I've seen over the years of how placeholders are indicated. You'll see it in API documentation as well, actually. And in fact, that's why we see it. I don't know the source of this convention. I'm sure there is a rational explanation. But when we're defining these paths, that's why we kind of see the same convention here of these angle brackets. It's the same idea. This is a placeholder for some other actual value.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. What else is on people's minds? Brian, yes, sir.
Hey, I think did you put something in installed apps for the .env?
Great question. I did not.
Okay.
Actually, that raises a really good point. And I did not do that for the requests library or requests OAuth lib either. And this touches on the way that different Python libraries are meant to be used and how tightly they integrate with Django, basically. Like Django REST framework, this REST framework library, this is something that someone wrote specifically to be used with Django. And under the hood, it hooks in with Django in all sorts of ways. And you can see that just like with these built-in sort of, or not built-in, but rather default Django apps, like an app isn't always just, you know, our own code that we're writing. It can have a lot of like functions and behavior that we can use across all of Django. And so that's, you know, why we have to add Django REST framework here, because it's really designed to hook in and work with Django specifically. Same with this cores headers library. But those other modules, requests OAuth lib, and .env, they're not specifically designed to be used with Django. We can easily use them in any Python program. And if we look at, if I go back to my API view real quick for the API app, if we look at how we're using like requests and requests OAuth, we can see that it's in a really straightforward manner. Like, it's not like this is, you know, a class that is the parent class of some other Django class that we're working with, or where these things are more integrated, if that makes sense. The real answer, if the question is how do I know when to add something to installed apps or not, would be we do have to look at the documentation for each module, and it'll tell us in the installation steps. But you know, like, you know, at the end of the day, our Django stuff is just Python code, and just like with any other Python program, we can install whatever dependencies we want and import and use them wherever we want. Just most of the time, we're, you know, really sort of doing stuff the Django way. And Django's perfectly fine with this. Like, it's not having a problem with this, because we're not trying to like fight Django or, you know, mess with the views of the routing logic or anything like that. Yeah, it's a great question. What other questions do people have?
Can I see your URL setup?
For the
I guess
the whole
going
project?
from yeah,
Yes.
that's fine.
Yeah, one sec. So it's pretty straightforward. I have added, right now it's super simple for our new Django app that I've called API app, where we're kind of putting all our noun project stuff. I've just added this one include at the project level for the routing. And then this route is just the base route. It doesn't have anything specific in it yet. And so we end up with API/v1/noun. And then that goes straight to our noun project API view.
All right,
For sure. What other questions do folks have, or what else is on people's minds?
Question. Could you did you actually say that the .env has a kind of relationship with the managed.py file?
Oh, only in that they both are in the root of the whole Django project.
Okay.
Like, if I take a look at this whole Pokédex project, I've got backend, front end. And for this whole thing, the project root is the Pokédex directory, right? Where the README is. But Django doesn't know or care about anything outside of this backend directory. Because from Django's perspective, because this is where the managed py file is, and this is where the directory for the Django project is, this is the root of the Django project. And the virtual environment directory doesn't have to go there. By the way, I just put it there to keep everything in one spot. So managed py is always going to be in the root of the Django project, because that's how Django builds a project when we create a new Django project. And we also want, and to make .env happy, I'm pretty sure need to put our .env file in the root of the Django project as well. And it also makes sense because we want to know what the heck this .env file is for. If we want an env file for React stuff, it should go inside the front end directory. Yeah, great question. What else is on people's minds?
Did you do anything in that get ignored? I think I missed that part.
Yes, I absolutely did. Thank you for asking. And that's probably the most important part of working with environment variables. So I created this file .env that's going to hold our secret key information. I never ever want that to get checked into version control into Git. So I created a .git ignore file here in this backend directory, and I told Git to ignore it. I'm also ignoring the virtual environment directory because we don't want or need to check that into version control either. I also, by the way, have a git ignore file in the front end directory. Veet actually generated this when we created the new project, and this ignores all this other stuff related to React. So you can have as many .git ignore files as you want all over your project, and there's absolutely no reason not to. Yeah, but specifically, we never ever want a .env file to end up in version control. So you're always going to want to add it to a .git ignore file. Yeah,
Thank you.
great question. What else is on people's minds?
Did you show us what you got in your run server for noun?
Yes. Let's see if it's still up there. It's not that much right now, because I'm sending back like the whole thing. Yeah, so it's a little hard to see, but you can do this in Thunder Client as well. This is my Django host, right? 127.0.0.1, which, by the way, localhost aliases too. It aliases to that IP address. So that host name is for that IP. Port 8000 API/v1 noun, and I'm just sending back all the stuff that I got from the noun project. Right? We're going to probably want to clean this up a bit later because we don't need all of it. And that's the beauty of having our own API as sort of an intermediate layer. But for now, we're effectively like passing it all through. But our secret key is safe on the server side, and our React program neither knows or cares that we're actually talking to the noun project to get this data. From the perspective of our React program, which we'll build out more in a bit, we're still interacting with our own Django API. And again, that's the beauty of an API. The term is a little overwrought, application programming interface, but the keyword there is interface. Like once I know the interface, I don't have to care about what happens under the hood. Let me go ahead and take the last step here and take us home to use these environment variables. And then I'm definitely down to answer some more questions or review the code some more. And then we can maybe take a little break and start writing some React code. But I wanna take us home. To recap, we've seen how in settings PY, I can use the .env module to grab my environment .env file and turn whatever I put in there into a Python dictionary. And I can interact with it like this, which is great, except I don't need the environment variables here in settings PY. I need them in my view file. So I'm going to do two things. The first thing is I'm actually going to leave this here in settings PY because as time goes on, we may want to add all sorts of other environment variables that have nothing to do with the noun project at all. And settings PY is where all the other global config stuff for our Django project lives. So this is a good spot to put this. This is going to look a little funny, but kind of remember that all we're actually doing is importing from a Django module. Because what I can actually do is from Pokédex proj settings, import env. And then I can do API key. In fact, I'm going to make, I really like keeping names the same. Because then when I start doing like find or say global find with like Command Shift F, I can do like noun project, and I can find everything that starts with noun project across my whole project. So I'm a big fan of consistent naming. So we're going to do, even though it's a bit verbose, so we're going to do noun project API key equals env get noun project API key. And then this is going to be the noun project secret key. And then I'll replace these here in just a moment. But just to reiterate what I'm doing here, this looks a little weird, but just the same way that I've got this file views.py, and that file is, every file in Python is also a module. Remember, like if I go to urls py here, from views, import noun project. So from any Python module, I can import like any top level class or function or variable. And so that's exactly what we're doing here, where this settings py file, it's also a Python module. It's full namespaces pokédex _ proj.settings. And then I can import this variable env. And since that's a dictionary, I can get the values that I care about. And I'll leave that there in case I did something wrong. But let's go ahead and use them and see how this works. And this is one of the nice things of, sometimes like a bunch of intermediate variables that aren't strictly necessary is too much work, but actually we kind of need it here, and it makes it really easy to modify stuff. So let's see if this works. That's the same squiggly we saw before about like a default timeout value. Just to double check, though it shouldn't matter, I'll kill and restart my server. And now let's see if we can still get our data. And I did run into an issue, and it looks like a JSON decoding error. So I wonder if this is like a typo hiding under the hood. And let's see if I can find good information here about where this is coming from. There's a bunch of stuff here. This error seems an awful lot bigger than I would have expected. So odds are I've just made a typo somewhere. So that is why I did not get rid of that other code. So let's do something even simpler. Let's print. Oh, yes.
See it. You have a T at the end of noun on your secret key.
Would that be
In the all caps part of that on
oh
line
yeah,
13.
NOUNT. Yep, totally. That makes sense. Perfect. Okay, that's such an easy typo to make. Let me actually very quickly finish kind of the flow of how to debug this, because I think this is the worst kind of error to make, because this is basically a magic string, right? This has to match up with the environment variable name. And so as we could see, my issue had nothing to do with JSON decoding. And from looking at this, and when I couldn't find like basically I skimmed like the very top of the error message for when it does sort of the trace back for file names, and the very bottom. And it wasn't really pointing to my code, it was pointing to all the other like libraries and modules that are being used. So because it said JSON decode error, because it wasn't pointing to somewhere in my code, and because I didn't make drastic changes or actually touch anything JSON related at all, I figured I'm breaking something else that's probably a typo. And then for whatever reason, this is what Django is throwing. And the way to debug something like this is basically to isolate the problem and simplify. Like I've got the old hard-coded OAuth stuff here. I pretty much knew the problem has to be right in these two lines of code, because these are really the only lines that I added, right? It's either here or here. So I was just going to run some print statements. And the print statement wouldn't exactly, well, actually it would tell me the problem, because if I print out the secret key, which was going to be the next thing that I do after printing out the API key, at that point, we should see some sort of error, right? If I hit this endpoint. So let's actually hit that endpoint with Thunder Client and watch the terminal and see what happens. Over, Brian, I really appreciate you pointing that out, because that definitely saves us a little time. So thank you. So ignoring my misspellings in my print statement, the fact that the secret key value is none tells me that I've done something wrong here, which is almost definitely a typo. And as you pointed out, that is absolutely what I did. So let's go ahead and in fact fix that. And as a sanity check, we can run this again, and we should in fact see the secret key being printed out. And now I don't like 90%, we have solved the error, right? It's always possible there is some other issue lurking, but it is pretty unlikely. So let's see if this works now. Voila, there we go. Yeah, thank you again for your help with that. And I think I will that stuff I will delete because we do have that in the lesson stuff for today. So we are now using environment variables, and we've seen not just for the not project API, but with .env, we've set it up so we can add environment variables for whatever we want and use them anywhere that we want in our Django program, which is awesome. So I just want to pause and check in and see what questions people have or what's on people's minds. And how are people feeling about this? Because I know that today is mostly going to be lecture, and that some people are coding along and some people aren't. So I just want to check in on like how the pace has been and stuff. Cool. I'll take it as positive feedback, and I think that we are probably at a good break point, because next up is we want to write out a bit more backend scaffolding code, but really integrate this with our front end. So let me actually just stop the recording, and then we can decide how long a break we want to do in our next